Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2664 of The Tom Woods Show, and we have with us our old friend Bob Murphy, host of The Bob Murphy Show. He holds a PhD in economics from NYU, a fact that I was reminded of a great many times as co-host of the former podcast, may it rest in peace, Contra Krugman. Bob is the author of many books. In fact, here's one. Now, I did this last time.
Right.
But if Ludwig von Mises is too intimidating for you to get through Human Action, you read Choice by Bob Murphy. And in particular, and Bob has a way of taking that material and using clear language and analogies for the reasonably educated non-expert. And what's interesting about this book is that let's see if is that when you open it up.
What's great is I have no idea what you're going to say. What is interesting about this book?
Here's what I'm going to say. The number of if you're watching on the screen, the testimonials take up page after page after page. And what's incredible about this, look, there's more, like 2 more facing pages of testimonials. Look at this. It keeps going. And in other words, what choice have you got but to go get choice, basically, right? And I might add that some of the people endorsing that book can't stand each other. Half these people are not on speaking terms with the other half, but they all agree Bob Murphy's book is worth reading. So,
I wondered when I saw some of those things, like, is this, some kind of private blackmail operation? Like, what do the people at the Independent Institute have on these people? Because the reviews they were giving me were just so glowing over the top. I was like, oh, wow.
Yeah, right. So it's not even just the number of them or the caliber of the people. It's the content of people, honestly, this must be one of the greatest books ever written. So
you would think. Can I, joking aside, and Tom, you know that I'm just a fount of humility, perhaps second only to your modesty. But let me just say on this, I feel like I have to say, since we're already spending so much time talking about that book, if you're somebody who's an old pro in Austrian economics and you've read Human Action, man, I promise you there's probably stuff in Choice that you didn't realize. So it's not that I invented something. It's that when I read Human Action for the umpteenth time to get ready to go write this, the chapter summary for Choice, I was like, oh, I never noticed that before in Human Action. Like, because I knew more economics by the time I had written that. So I'm just saying I noticed some connections and things in Human Action that I hadn't realized at that point, and I spell it out in Choice. So, and I've had even like grad students have come to me who are reading it like as a lark, because they just said, oh yeah, I'll do this as a passive. I don't need this for my coursework because I already know all this stuff. I read Hayek and Prices of Production. And they were like, oh my gosh, I never got what he was doing with the business cycle theory until I said, so anyway, I would just humbly say that.
All right, excellent. So we'll link to that at tomwoods.com/2664 and in the video description. So let's talk about some things that seem boring, but we will make exciting.
Okay.
Look, maybe it's going to be 1 out of 2. They seem boring and we make them boring. I don't know, but let's talk about some things that nobody else really wants to, but we got to. And that is these fiscal issues that the U.S. is facing, but particularly as they pertain to this debate over the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which after passing the House went to the Senate. And as the story goes, the Senate stripped it of some of the provisions that had been inserted in there to persuade conservatives to hold their noses and go ahead and vote for it. Then those were taken out. And then what Daniel McAdams calls the lobotomized version of the big beautiful bill, the Senate version, will then once again go to the House for their final approval and then on to the president. And the idea here is that virtually nobody in the House who voted for it the first time is going to have the guts to say, well, I can't vote for it now. Now you've made it so much worse. No, it's more like, hey, you already voted for it. You have no choice but to vote for it again. Now, it is a big bill, so there are a lot of aspects to it, but we're thinking primarily about what it does with regard to the budget and the debt. Now, I know that there are some people on the right these days who say, if this were 10 years ago, I would have agreed with you. I understand that the debt in principle is a bad thing, but in practice, we seem to have been able to live with it. and I need the immigration enforcement whose spending is allocated in this bill more than I need a balanced budget. So I'm sorry, but I have to hold my nose and just go ahead and approve of that. So there's this sense that the debt is something that we can probably live with if it came to that. So with that as background, Bob, how do you want to jump into this?
If I may, I think this is probably the right time while we still have people's attention and their train of thought here focused. If I can show 3 quick slides that I prepared recently, I was at Pork Fest and I made this presentation, and so I think that would just facilitate this, just so the viewer can see some things going along with what I'm saying.
And if you're listening, we will describe them to you.
Yes.
All right, let's see them. Okay, what do we got?
Okay, so this one is just showing, this is from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, and they're described as nonpartisan. I actually would just say this, I don't think that's a ridiculous claim in this context, that they actually, I think, do try to get it right. They just get their marching orders, the way they have to structure these things. So in any event, this is what their most recent, I think this was from March, projection of the federal debt held by the public is, as a share of GDP. That's what that means. And you can see that the context here, you can see that the title I gave the PowerPoint slide was Moody's downgrade of Treasury debt. So recently, Moody's was the third of the 3 big rating, S&P, Fitch, and Moody's, to downgrade Treasury debt from AAA down to, they went one notch lower to AA1, I think is how they, what their second from the top is called. And again, that was S&P and Fitch had already done this years past. And among other things, just say, look at this, there's no indication that the authorities in Washington are going to get this under control. And so this is just showing how things look. So just very quickly, people will often say, okay, yeah, the fact that the federal debt held by the public is roughly the size of the economy at this point, right? 100% of GDP. Sure, that's a big number, and it's alarming that it's risen so fast, so rapidly. Just you can see how much it's risen just, since the financial crisis. But, this is how big it was back during World War II. But the thing is, say what you will about the U.S. century and the World War, and I know, Tom, you and I and many of your guests have very unorthodox views on that topic. That was a one-off, crisis where the federal government had huge deficits for, 5 years in a row, and then they slashed spending dramatically going into 45, 46. And so that's why the debt as a share of the economy shrank so rapidly in the 50s and 60s. It's not so much, they weren't running budget surpluses. It's just that the U.S. economy was growing faster than that big stock of outstanding debt. And that's why, the debt as a share of the economy shrank. There's nothing like that this time around, right? It's not that there was just this one big spike in spending because of COVID and, now we could just cut spending 40% and then we'll get things. There's nothing so yeah, there was a big spike in spending, but there's not room for it to fall back, right? That the reason the debt is projected to grow so much over time is that the so-called unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare are transforming into explicit Treasury debt, as people have to get more in checks from those programs than the current workers are kicking in and their FICA so-called contributions, right? And so what is an, quote, unfunded liability gets transformed into explicit Treasury debt over time, and that's what you see there. So there's no easy fix to this. And you just see that just keeps going as far as the eye can see. And I should mention, there's nothing built in here about interest rates rising rapidly. In fact, these projections assume that interest on the federal debt is lower through 2050 than it has been looking backwards over 20 years. Okay, and so they're not projecting like some bondholders having a rally or something and dumping U.S. Treasury debt. They're also not forecasting a recession. All right, so this is just showing the standard rules of engagement. This is how things will continue under a normal scenario, just with the existing legislation. Okay, so now as far as the big beautiful bill, let me just mention. I got 2 slides for you folks here. I want to explain the debate. So somebody like a Stephen Miller, this is from a few weeks ago, he was running around like he couldn't understand. He's like, well, this bill, it has record spending cuts and record tax cuts. So why are people like Massey and Rand Paul opposed to it? And at first I just thought he was exaggerating. So I looked up the CBO scoring of it and I understand what Miller's he wasn't lying, right? So what this is showing is over a 10-year horizon, which is how they score these things. The estimated impact on outlays, which means spending, is negative $1.3 trillion. Okay, so he's saying it's going to cut spending by $1.3 trillion. The effect on revenues, it's going to cut revenues relative to the counterfactual baseline by $3.7 trillion. And so that's why it's going to, quote, increase the deficit over 10 years by $2.4 trillion, right? The difference in those numbers. So his point was, yeah, this makes the debt higher than it otherwise would be, but that's just because we're giving so much money back to the taxpayers. It is cutting spending. And so if you think, and Elon at the time was sharing videos of Milton Friedman saying the true burden of government is its spending, right? The other methods of financing it are sort of irrelevant in terms of that. So that's kind of where Stephen Miller was coming from. Last slide I'll show you, folks. The problem with that, or the reason that's misleading, as true as it may be, is that when the CBO does that scoring, they're taking, current legislation as the default. And so this chart, it actually was difficult for me to dig these numbers up. They were spread out in two different reports to compile them. But you can see here that the blue line is showing what happens to federal spending over the next 10 years under the status quo. And then you see those red bars are what happens with the big, beautiful bill as of, a month ago, right? The version back then that they were debating. And so you can see this is what, guys like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey and then Elon Musk eventually, when he threw in the towel and just said, I can't go along with this. This is insane. That this is the one time, we've got all the forces have aligned, all the stars have aligned, where we actually might get the public to support us if we have, aggressive cuts that might cause some pain over the next 12, 18 months. But hey, we're doing this for the future. This is the one shot we have. And this is what we're going to do right here. When I just showed you, the 2 slides ago, what the default looks like in terms of the impact on the debt. And now we're just going to we're going to have the debt rise even more rapidly than what the CBO was forecasting. And these are the piddly spending cuts that Stephen Miller's running victory laps over. Okay, so that's kind of the situation, just for people to get a sense of the back and forth. And you can see, so, to your point, I guess if somebody says, hey, this is how it is. If we don't vote for this thing, we're going to get nothing. That means the Trump tax cuts from the first term are going to expire. We're going to have a massive tax hike. There's going to be a recession where the debt's going to be even worse. Out of that scenario, the Democrats are going to crush us in the midterms. And then we're going to have, illegals flown over the border. And then we're going to have socialism in 4 years. I can't say that that's wrong. But on the other hand, it's like, well, at some point, if you're doing the lesser of two evils, if it's just 0.1% less evil than the other thing, at what point are you allowed to just say, no, I'm not doing this. This is crazy.
So that's the situation. So it's not at all that somebody like a Massey is a nitpicker, or it's because he's gonna stand behind his principles even as the country burns. I guess his point is the country's going to burn because of this thing, not because of my opposition to it.
Right. So obviously, we don't know the counterfactual. Like the fact that Massey is opposed to this and saying, I can't go along with this, for all we know, maybe if they did have something that was really aggressive, he would still say, no, anarcho-capitalism or bust. We don't know what he would do. But I'm saying the fact, given his behavior, I can totally understand why people who are saying this is our shot, like if we don't do something significant right now with this thing, given the opportunity we have when we have the House, we have the Senate, we've got Trump in there, we had Doge and all that. The public was with us. Remember how excited we were openly, Trump was talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. I mean, the public was ripe for radical change. And so this idea that, let's just, cut spending a little, let's slow the rate of, it's not even cutting spending, let's slow the rate of growth of spending a little bit. And then, keep the tax plan as there. Because that's the thing too, it's not even like the public would perceive this massive tax cut. It's rather the big, beautiful bill averts a tax increase that's scheduled to occur, right? So it's a weird, you could say that's good, but the point is it's not like all of a sudden this is going to unleash all this entrepreneurship and business creation. It just means it's going to avoid crushing that, is what the status quo is going to bring it. So yes, Tom, I'm saying I think that's the argument people are making, is that we need to strike now. We're not going to get another chance like this if we just kick the can down the road. And then 2, like look at all the energy and political capital people put into this and rolling back the state. Doge, I think, already kind of discredited this momentum for reform that people were so excited about that. A lot of people a few months ago, and now it looks like, it didn't work. Like in other words, I've been resharing my my book on Texas secession because, and I kind of like didn't say that for a while because I didn't want to look like a party pooper, but I'm like, okay, I personally don't think this plan of electing the right people and sending them to Washington is going to work. Like if this didn't work this time around, when is it going to work? And so that's kind of where I think these people are coming from, that we don't do something now, this just isn't going to work ever.
Hey everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you're a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. What if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking? Use your website as a lead generation engine. What if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO Expert Search Engine Optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help.
Yeah, I mean, if you basically have all three branches of government, basically, and you have crazy momentum. You have a polarizing president, but one who can command the loyalty or allegiance of a huge number of people, who twists arms to get his way. If now isn't the time that you do it, then obviously it'll never happen.
And if I could, just to elaborate on what you just said, I think you just hit the nail on the head, Tom. I mean, we just sort of taken it for granted at this point because we just know Trump rolls like this, where he's trying to primary. What if instead he had spent the last 2 months just saying, look, I'm a businessman or whatever. This is crazy. If somebody came to me and their private business was run like this with this kind of debt, that'd be crazy. We need to fix it. And he just, because this is common sense stuff, right? Like looking at those charts, it's the weird academics who are out of touch that are saying, oh, no, this is fine because we can just print money. You know what I mean? Like I think normal people seeing those charts would get the sense that, yeah, that probably isn't a good idea. And that if he's, really just championed and said, yeah, your favorite program might get slashed 20%, but you know what? We have to do this. Let's do, and they made it broad based. So it wasn't just any, some particular people were getting crushed and other people were getting away with their goodies. If they really did a widespread, broad based cutting of government spending, I think the public would get behind that. And assuming, Tom, you and I are right about our economic views, it actually would be fine by the midterms. You know what I mean? So like the predictions, in other words, there's a lot of implicit Keynesians walking around the Republican Party right now who are saying, no, we need to have this massive spending increase because otherwise the economy is going to tank and we're going to get crushed in the midterms. That's like, oh, thank you, John Maynard Keynes.
Well, the thing is, even when the Republicans propose a budget that does nothing other than slow the rate of growth of spending, that gets referred to as a budget cut by the Democrats all the time. So everyone is under the impression that the Republicans have been cutting the budget consistently because that's all they hear about. So if you were to actually cut the budget, how could the press get any worse? Everyone already assumes you're doing that anyway. Why not just do it? Everyone assumes you're cutting it anyway.
Yeah, and if would they say, oh, they might call Trump Hitler if he did that. So we better watch out. We don't want them to criticize him.
The insults can't get a whole lot worse.
Right. So I think you're right. And that's, again, I think the argument from, various quarters about why this is just too inadequate is that the situation we're in, I forget, I can't remember if it was Rand Paul or Massey, but one of them made they said, this, the old joke about rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. They said, this is more like turning it so we're steering, going into the iceberg even faster than we were before. Right. And then, so, to allude to Stephen Miller's point, it's like, oh, well, right now they're turning the thing to head for it even harder, and then what we're doing is slowing the rate at which we're turning into the iceberg or something. You know what I mean? It's hard to come up with the right analogy, but it is, as those charts showed, spending is going way up, even with the so-called big beautiful bill that has quote record spending cuts. And so again, it's just this is crazy that this is the kind of thing we're talking about. And as far as the tax cuts, again, they're not even. Like, it would be one thing, and I could totally get behind it, and I don't know if you want to spend a moment this time, that, Rothbard has a bunch about it's okay like if the government is going to renege on its treasury debt, from a libertarian perspective, that's not certainly violating anyone's rights. That in fact, taxing people to pay back others who voluntarily lent to the government. It's like, well, what'd you do that for? And so, that I think the other things equal, a libertarian should support a genuine tax cut, even if spending stays the same, because it's like, well, yeah, it's future taxation, but maybe not. They might default, right? And so from a property rights libertarian perspective, that's fine. And so if the reason this big, beautiful bill, quote, increased the deficit was because they had massive tax rate reductions, I could see that too. But again, with this particular thing, it's where all that's coming from is mostly, there's stuff about reducing taxes on tips and things like that, but it's mostly just making permanent the tax cuts from the first Trump administration, which is fine insofar as it goes. But again, it's not like people are going to feel that their tax burden was just lightened. It's just they're going to avoid having it massively hiked again.
Now, thinking exclusively about my own personal interests, my view has always been I am much better at hedging against inflation than I am against taxation. So if I have a choice of getting taxes lowered, which will mean that the deficit is higher, and then they might be inclined to print more money, in effect, I can hedge against that better than I can hedge against a $500,000 bill from the IRS. So I personally would rather have that. But it's not like I'm choosing between kinds of poison,
right,
knowing that they all harm me, but I just want to be harmed as little as possible. So I have that
right. And there's also that old they called it starve the beast, and I think some people actually did earnestly advance that as a thesis, and I don't think that that's ridiculous. Like that, in other words, just to make sure everyone's understanding what we're talking about, that other things equal, if they said, hey, we're going to keep spending as it is, but we can cut everyone's the tax rate and all the brackets by 3 percentage points, take it or leave it, I would say take it. Because like you say, there's a sense from a rights-based perspective that's lowering the aggression, if you want to call it that, right now. And it's true that makes the debt higher than otherwise would be. But down the road, for all we know, because the debt now carried in the future is that much higher and the interest payments and so on are higher, that might put more pressure on future Congresses to cut spending at that point. Whereas what I think really wouldn't make sense is to say, hey, we got this debt problem right. You know what? We should raise taxes $300 billion to at least shrink the deficit and start being responsible, but keep spending as it is. That just means we're doing right now the bad thing that might happen down in the future, right? And so I from a libertarian and even like an Austrian perspective, I don't think that follows. So I agree that it is foolish and short-sighted for Republicans to always just kick the can down the road and just say, so what, just as long as we keep taxes low, let's keep spending high, because that we get various people on board, coalitions and whatever, with the spending gravy train, that's a bad idea. They should just cut spending across the board. But again, if the narrow choice is between having a higher deficit or raising taxes to close the gap, I actually don't think that that's the responsible thing to do.
I ask this a lot because, as I said before, a lot of people feel like they're starting to think that maybe deficits don't matter, as has been said. And so I'd like to know what would actually happen? Like, what are we going to notice happening specifically because the deficit, but more importantly, the debt got too high? Like, how is that going to affect the average American? And will he realize that these effects are caused by the debt? Because a lot of times, the government will do crazy things and it'll harm people, but nobody realizes where the harms are coming from.
Right. So I think it will eventually, and this is the kind of thing where it's with a lot of this stuff that it's going to be, it's not too bad, not too bad, and all of a sudden it's going to be a disaster, right? That it's the kind of thing where what would happen, mechanically speaking, is that if investors around the world suddenly became concerned about the U.S. Treasury's willingness to either explicitly pay, maintain payment on existing debt, and or if they thought, oh, they're really just going to print money in order to cover that, and you're going to see the dollar's purchasing power fall. So yeah, I'm holding a $10,000 Treasury security. They're going to give me the $10,000 in 3 years when it's due, but the $10,000 is not going to buy what I thought it was going to when I originally lent them the money, right? So those are two possible things. That if that starts happening, then you're going to see yields on treasuries start rising. And if that happens quickly, given the outstanding stock of government debt, because they're constantly rolling it over too, like as it's maturing, a lot of it's just they're rolling it over and reborrowing. And so the point is, if interest rates rise even just a point or two, that could end up meaning hundreds of billions of dollars more just in interest expense per year, right? So just recently we had, I think for the first time, at least in modern history, the explicit cost of paying interest on the federal debt was higher than what they spent on the military. Okay. I mean, and that was, when you and I were like Republican nerds or conservative nerds, in the high school time, that would have been the kind of thing where they were saying, if we don't get our act together, eventually down the road, stuff like this will happen. And that would have seemed like an unbelievable tragedy. Whereas now it's like, oh yeah, I guess that, yeah, they've been borrowing a lot lately.
Or it would have seemed like something that only an alarmist would say.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, it's not going to happen next Thursday, but the point is that it can't continue forever, right? That I think most people would acknowledge, yeah, the government debt can't get to be 600 times GDP. That at some point something would happen in between now and then to make that not possible. And so what is there some magic level? Not necessarily. And Japan has a big debt to GDP ratio and so forth. But the mere fact that, hey, we can just always print money, that's not the panacea that I think a lot of people believe it is. And so that is the issue, that it just can't continue forever. And then if it does start moving, then that's really going to box in policymakers. And so to answer your original question, how would that pinch show up? They would be then forced into a position of saying, geez, we can, going into next year's budget process, we're going to have this extra $400 billion expense on just paying interest on the debt compared to this year that we weren't building in. So where are we going to come up with that? And you can say, oh, we'll just print it. But what if CPI is already running at 5%? That's the thing, that they might be in a situation where they have too bad outcome. They can either cut spending or they can, let price inflation just run rampant, even though everyone thinks, oh yeah, the Fed ought to hike rates in order to, quell the inflation. But then it's like, well, no, we can't do that because then that means the explicit interest cost of the Treasury goes way up, right? So you could be in a situation like that. And I think that people are not adequately taking that into account. So again, that's why I think these ratings agencies started to downgrade the debt, is because they realized this can't continue forever. It couldn't be that if the debt's 600 times GDP, we're still giving Uncle Sam a AAA. So that's why they're starting to acknowledge reality and dial it back.
We're talking about Fed chairman, and brings to mind the conflict between Trump and Jerome Powell. Trump has had choice words for Powell. His arguments have, he's at least been insinuating, he may have said explicitly, that the reason that Powell is hesitating to cut rates for political reasons because he doesn't like Trump. And Trump and now J.D. Vance seem to be saying the circumstances seem to allow for it. Price inflation is obviously under control, so now there's no reason for the Fed not to lower rates. And then they're trying to say that nominal interest rates in other countries are considerably lower than they are in the U.S., and so why can't we be like those countries? What do you take from all that?
So the people who are complaining about the Fed's policies, I don't think that they're necessarily merely being partisan. That, in other words, they sit, for example, they weren't afraid to cut, going into the last election when by several objective criteria, you could say, no, the situation now would warrant cutting more than back then, right? And so I can see people who think, hey, maybe Powell's doing it, maybe he was trying to favor Biden, but now he's mad at Trump, maybe just out of pure spite for the stuff Trump's been saying about him. Who knows? So those people, they make a plausible case. They're not just making stuff up that on paper it could look that. On the other hand, I do think that what Powell has been doing, I mean, if you look, it's not money print or go burr, that the Fed's balance sheet has been steadily shrinking for a while now. Okay, now it's way bigger now than it would have been on any normal trajectory pre 2008. That's for sure. So it's still a very bloated balance sheet compared to normal times. But my point is, given how much they blew up the Fed's assets, in the wake of the financial crisis, and then again right after COVID, when in 2020 they really ramped it up, they have been trying to bring it back down, but more towards reality. So again, I'm not in these people's heads, but I think it's plausible to say that what Powell is doing, it's not that he's reading Austrian economics or he cares about the plight of the common man or something, but just if you're kind of from the banking class and you want to not let those people get crushed, right? In other words, the Fed printed a bunch of money or electronically created a bunch of money during those crises, and you kind of realize we need to dial it back a little bit. We got to, let some of those assets roll off and mature, shrink the total amount of reserves in the system to maintain global confidence in the dollar as the reserve currency. And so we have to show we're serious and we're okay with a little bit of pain, and we want to err on the side of caution and keep monetary policy relatively tight. I could see someone having that view if they think that, hey, this is kind of a struggle between like the West and the dollar system versus some of these other upstarts, and we kind of have to shore up our strength at this point. And hey, if some people have a tough time and lose their jobs or whatever, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
Folks, I know homeschooling families that are running themselves ragged, trying to keep up with everything. They're overwhelmed by unfinished housework and kids at different grade levels, holding everything together. Well, that's where the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum comes in. It gives homeschooling parents their mental health back by taking so much of the burden off their shoulders. Not to mention, with the Ron Paul curriculum, your worldview has a fighting chance of being passed on to your children. Your students will learn all the standard subjects. You should see how much the middle schoolers love the science courses. They often want to go ahead to the next grade because they're enjoying them so much. Your high schoolers will learn government and Western Civ from me. And in addition to the usual subjects, they'll also learn things no government school will teach them, like how to manage their money, how to be an effective public speaker, how to run a home business. Plus, join through my link and you'll get $160 in free bonuses from me. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. That's ronpaulhomeschool.com.
Well, how would you, though, as an Austrian, evaluate this argument that the Fed really should lower rates because now, the excuse that would be given is that we can't risk unleashing price inflation, or let's say we're enduring price inflation, then we certainly can't do that. But we're not now, and the economy could get some juice if they would only, be not quite so obstinate and go ahead and lower the rates. So, everyone takes for granted that that's the correct analysis, I think. Is there anything wrong with it?
Well, yeah. So as an Austrian hard money person, I mean, regardless of the particulars of, hey, what's the unemployment rate now? Right now, what's consumer price inflation running? Is it running hot? Just in general, I would obviously the first best solution is to get rid of government intervention and money and banking altogether and let the economy, people freely choose what to use as the money. But given that the government is going to, quote, be in charge of the money and that sort of thing, going back to like a classical gold standard would be way better in my view than what we're doing right now. And so that would mean, a very, quote, hard money policy. And it wouldn't be setting interest rate like, oh, so would you raise or lower interest rates? I would just, fix like the dollar price of an ounce of gold, whatever number it is, right now, just lock that in and maybe start having some of the Fed's assets shift away from mortgage-backed securities into gold just to make it credible that, yeah, we could, move in and out of dollars at that price and let interest rates do whatever they're going to do, right? Like we're not setting oil prices. We're not setting land prices. Why would we set interest rates? Why would you think the government or some organ of it should have anything to do with that, right? So the idea that, oh, well, right now it's kind of unfair to Trump that the Fed should be loosening right now. No, you're not doing the economy any favors by, quote, loosening. All you're doing is causing an unsustainable boom. And so, yeah, that might make things look better for Trump politically over the next 18 months, but you're certainly not putting the U.S. economy on a stronger footing. And to, quote, be, stingy and take away the punch bowl right now and, oh, man, you're going to make the unemployment rate go up. That from an Austrian perspective, that's the mechanism, if that does happen, that means it was loose money that was causing workers to go into lines where they shouldn't be. And so you're actually, getting people back to where they ought to go. And yes, to go from the current loosey-goosey policy of, really loose money versus kind of loose money, which is kind of what we oscillate between, to an actual hard money standard, there would be probably a crash up front. But then once that was over with, boom, the business cycle as we know it would be over with, again, assuming that guys like you and I are right, Tom, about how we think the world works. So that's kind of the way I would analyze it. This idea that, we're always going to have ups and downs in the business cycle and we just got to thread that needle. And I think that's just a totally misguided paradigm.
So that's what you would also say to an investor who, let's say, is naive about monetary policy, but who knows that in general, his portfolio seems to do well on days in which the Fed seems dovish about interest rates.
Oh, right. So everything I just said, that if you're an investor and you need to watch markets, I mean, it's the kind of the Keynesian beauty contest is the analogy or the metaphor that captured that. It's in the short term, especially, you have to know what everyone else is going to think about assets too, right? In order for you to make money. So yes, those things can be relevant, but the fact that, the quote market goes down if the Fed signals that it might tighten or something, that should not be construed as, so that means it's bad for the economy. That in general, there is a disconnect there. And also, I would say, if investors and everybody really did come to believe that, we're on a hard money standard now, and then once we got through, that initial crash perhaps, and then we were on solid footing and had sustainable growth going forward, I do think in real terms, the investors who own stocks in that kind of an economy would outperform investors who were, holding assets in some other country where the central bank there was inflating all the time. So I'm not saying that, this would hurt investors but help the common man or the blue collar worker. I think everybody would end up being richer in an economy with a strong currency, so with sound money. Like that's kind of the idea, that it's money performs a vital role in facilitating economic calculation, and you're not doing anybody any favors by constantly coming in and messing with those signals.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been talking about this for as long as we've known each other, and the trouble is just that a lot of investors don't really want to think about the long term. They think about, the Fed is making an announcement at 2 p.m. today. Let's see what that 2 p.m. announcement is. And then they see there's a little bit of a spike in, a lot of stock prices. And that's as much as they want to know. Like I hear there aren't that many Jim Grants in the world of finance. Instead, it's a lot of people, I think, who have very superficial understandings of these things and who just think, Fed lowers interest rates, number go up. And it's tricky to crack through that, unfortunately.
Well, right, but it's not so much. I mean, they're not wrong if what they want to do is just show.
Makes it tricky.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, I mean, this is going to seem like it's out of left field, but the thing that disillusioned me years ago, I had written a report for a California state-based think tank about how they could reform that you go to a flat tax at the state level. And some newly elected Republican, he flew me. I was in Nashville. He flew me out there. I met with the guy. He wanted to introduce it in the next session or whatever it's called. And he understood it, right? He wasn't just some glad handler and, tax cuts, entrepreneurship, yay. No, he understood it. And his chief of staff was like, sir, this won't even get out of committee. Other Republicans will kill this. And then when you go up for re-election, they're just going to hang this over your head about how you want to give these huge tax giveaways to the rich. So why would you do it? And by the end of things, Dr. Murphy, thanks for coming out here. We'll be in touch. I never heard from the guy again. And so the point of all that was just that, once you see how the system and everybody's incentives are correct in their own little narrow sphere, but when you look at the outcome, you just realize, that's what, I mean, even the stuff with the big, beautiful bill and everything, we see how this is happening. It is insane that Trump, I mean, he had the Secret Service, at the very least, was asleep on the job or had something to do with it. He's not going after them. He's going after Thomas Massey. That's who he's spending his time going after. And the people, so it's insane in terms of like who gets rewarded and who gets penalized in the system. And that's how it is. So I don't have any solution. I'm being a good libertarian guest here for you. I don't have any solutions, but we can, if you're asking me, what should the Fed lower interest rate, I'm going to tell you the truth. And I don't know how we make that happen. And if the Fed did, like Powell doing what I think is the right thing to do, given the constraints he has, is to, quote, keep monetary policy tight. And what's happening? He's not being lauded for people by, maintaining strength of the dollar. No, he's getting lambasted for, trying to sabotage Trump.
All right. Here's something. I realized that I gave you this oddball introduction where I focused obsessively on your important book choice. And I forgot to mention, as I should, because that you do have a day job, you have a profession, and you are chief economist at Infinio. Now, last time you were on, you explained what they're doing over there. Can you explain that again? Maybe take it down a notch for people who don't know what the word blockchain means.
Okay, sure. So everyone's heard of Bitcoin at this point. And so the technology that Bitcoin runs on is called the blockchain. And so that's just this decentralized public ledger that just keeps track of, when you, quote, spend Bitcoins on something, the ledger there's a way that everybody who's downloaded copies of that ledger can just keep track of and understand that, yes, the rightful owner of those Bitcoins at that address, transfer them to this address over here. And there's a way that the system, mathematically can know that only the rightful owner has the power to do that and so forth. And then once that move gets made, it gets copied and all the various copies of the database around the world or the ledger around the world reflect that change. Okay, so that's what the blockchain is. And so then after Bitcoin showed how that could be done, people then start saying, well, why can't we put other things on blockchains? And so one element of that is what's called tokenization of real world assets. And so there the idea is, well, you have what they mean by real world stuff like, real estate or bottles of wine or gold bullion or what have you. It's a real physical asset out there from conventional finance, but we want to have like a digital twin, a token on blockchains that can be transferred around. And we just know that corresponds to the ownership stake or interest in the actual real world asset. And so you have the advantages and the convenience of blockchain technology and the transparency and so forth, but also it's not just this, intangible, okay, I control some Bitcoins, great, what does that do for me? Right? So that's this whole enterprise. And so Infinio, what we're focusing on is taking life insurance assets and putting them on the blockchain. And then because there's a lot of properties about life insurance as an asset class that make it very advantageous, but it's a pretty old conservative industry and it's hard. Like as you're an investor, you can't just move in and out of life insurance the way you might say, I want to move in and out of treasuries, or let me move in and out of mortgage-backed securities. You can say, give me a $2 million exposure to life insurance assets. Like that's just how it works. But what we're building at Infinio would allow for that type of thing as well as a lot more. So people should go to infinio.ai if that sounded interesting.
All right, we'll put that up at tomwoods.com/2664. All right, well, Bob, somebody had to do it, and you did it. Coming on here, giving us that fiscal briefing, and monetary briefing. So we appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to having an opportunity to make my own appearance on the Bob Murphy Show for the first time in a while.
Ooh, teasing that. Okay, yes, yeah. Indeed.
That'll be fun. BobMurphyShow.com. I mean, he couldn't make it any easier on you. Thanks again, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.